Yes. So, okay, first of all, a common piece. These slides, or this talk, is going to contain a lot of red and a lot of cats. So I said what I had to say, so it's a good time to start. Now, this talk is about the lessons learned. More specifically, it's about things that we did on Smashing Mac, which were kind of a bit experimental, if you ask me. But many of the things we learned, I think, are very, very interesting and very helpful. Now, my name is Vitaly. I was born in Belarus and moved to Germany 16 years ago. And I co-founded this little website 11 years ago now. And it's being redesigned, and we're still in progress, and we're still in process. And we hope to launch next month. This has been a journey starting from late December 2015, and I can't wait to see it finished. I really can't. And I can't see red anymore, but this is something we'll talk about today. Now, this talk is about 4 parts, but I'm going to focus mostly on front-end and process and a bit of back-end, and kind of give you an overview of all the things we learned along the way. Now, obviously, there is always a start. Why the hell would you do a big redesign? I'm not a big fan of big bang redesigns, obviously, but there are a couple of problems that we had to solve. And more specifically, we had one important problem. This clicker isn't working. Excellent. We had one important problem, and the problem was kind of urgent, and the reason for that problem was actually ad blockers. Now, I'm not here to say don't use ad blockers. I'm using one on my own as well, and I think that everybody should be using ad blockers. And I think it's something that we are kind of reinvented as a tool to fight against nasty and dirty and slow advertising. So please do use one, but it was a problem for us, of course. Because if we look back into what things used to be like, the layout and everything was really dictated by the problems we had with the sizing we had for advertising. And so instead of fighting it, like, adding a paywall or things like that, we said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to embrace it. So we had this little message for a while. We use ad blockers as well. We got to keep the service running, though. Did you know that we publish books and stuff and so on and so forth? Kind of being a friendly message. And I was very surprised by how strong and empathetic the community is, because most people were actually buying things, which was really, really incredible. But still, we had a big problem with ad revenue, which we were kind of losing. And if you look into it, that was a really big problem. It was a really big deal. Because just over 2 years or so, okay, it's going to be an experiment in all kind of clickers. Oh, thank you. So just by looking back into all the, just by looking back into all the issues we had, every single year we had exactly the same problem appearing over and over again. We would almost expect 50% of revenue drop from advertising every year, right? And of course we know you are smart cookies, so most of you are using ad blockers anyway. In fact, we had, over the last 2 years or so, we had a growth from 13% to over 60%, which basically meant this should be, this is not working, so advertising isn't working. We had to rethink the way we actually produce content and the way we present ourselves. And this is where membership has become so important. And it had to become the central point of what we do. But there was no way to meaningfully display it because we're kind of limited in the scope of the article layout and the magazine layout that we had. Had become a replacement. We wanted to bring focus back to our products. We wanted to highlight products prominently, kind of show what we have rather than hide them in a way somewhere in the sidebar behind all those nasty ads. And it was also important to kind of be transparent and initiate a dialogue with the community. So we said, this is what it's going to be, right? When we do run this, and this is again what we started doing in like 2015, we want to be public about it. So we're going to explore how we spend the money and the things that we actually do. Moving away from this to something a bit more mature. And it wasn't only about that. That was a central product we wanted to push, but it was also about creating a unified platform. Now, starting from day one, because Smashing was an experiment, we just sat on WordPress and we decided to just set a random theme and just go. But there was never like a thorough process behind it. We never actually thought about what a Smashing experience would be. And I wanted personally to make sure that we create something that really speaks for this unified platform that Smashing has become, because we have job boards and other things, not so important. But the task was kind of complicated. We had to create a build tool or a system that would enable us to actually build a magazine, or CMS for 2,500 articles, a comment engine for 200,000 comments, an e-commerce platform for purchases, a subscription service, a job board, and a membership or authentication or login in one central place from scratch. That wasn't an easy task, and this is why it kind of took us a long time. And it also took a team, right? So there are two main people who are like just incredible to work with. The visual design was mostly done by Daniel Moll and front end by Sarah, but we had many, many people involved in all the parts of this process as well. We have Andrew for exploration and Ilya for front end, who is kind of taking over. Now, they were not involved all the time, right? But they were all involved to some degree at some point. And this poor guy, Ricardo from Brazil, he dreams in cats now because he had to design 58 freaking illustrations of cats. And as you can guess, they all had to be responsive as well. So multiply that times 4. He dreams in cats, poor guy, right? But then also backend and animation, Sarah was helping, I think Stability, Hayden, and many people are involved in a project like this. But the first thing you have to ask yourself, so what do we need to care about most here? Well, what is the browser landscape here? Well, it was actually quite predictable. It wasn't that hard to deal with browsers, for us at least. When you look into the browser stack, that's kind of a nice environment to be working in, right? We have approximately now 20% mobile. Internet Explorer is still dying, not dead, but still dying. But it's not quite true, to be honest. This data is not true, because there is one person who is trying to make fun of me every single year, coming into the Smasher magazine with IE666. And it's not a joke, it's always skews my data and it always ruins it, right? And so this is a nice data to work with. This is a nice browser stats to work with. So we did our research, and we did our IA, and we did all the things that we need to do. And we started thinking about modular design and atomic design, of course. And this is something that we were building from the start. But it turned out that it was kind of difficult to see the big picture behind all those little modules. So we had to kind of quickly move away from something very predictable and small to something a bit bigger. And we started looking into visual design, and we started looking into personality, right? How can we convey this new visual presence that we want to achieve? And so what we started with is, of course, exploration of typefaces. And it was a really difficult decision for me because, we co-founded it like 11 years ago, and I always saw Smashing as being this respectful, professional publication, which is not how Smashing was perceived by most of audience at all. Because when we started running interviews, we realized quite quickly that most people were saying things like playful, friendly, nice, damn cats, right? And the reason for that is, the conferences we're running, which have the cats in them as well. And so for me, it was like, so what do we do? Do we embrace the way we want to be, and do we embrace the way people see us? So we settled on that typeface. That typeface. That typeface so drives me nuts. I can't see it. It's so bad. But it's not bad. It's really, obviously, it's pretty good. But it's kind of a different personality and perspective, quirkiness that's related to it. And this is why also so many different, very different cats, right? And it was also about finding the right angle. And I actually mean it literally, because we definitely did have to find the right angle. And so when we started kind of exploring, it was all about trying to figure out what would be a nice new magazine experience. You had to rethink everything and kind of start from scratch. What would the experience be? So we thought about maybe something like this, right? I could just be a bit more playful. And then there was this idea, why don't we just take something that's a signature for Smashing magazine, which is like the tilting of the logo. We redesigned the tilting. It was 11.6 degrees, now it's 11 degrees. It's a big deal for me. It really is. So it's now 11 degrees, and I said, let's take it, and this is going to become the thing. This is going to be everywhere, literally everywhere. It doesn't have to be like, a big deal. It doesn't have to be too visible, but it should be everywhere. So one of the first explorations looked like this. And we kind of wanted to maybe look a bit beyond that, what we could do to make it a bit more interesting. And as you can see, it's never been finished, so the images are a bit off, right? And for me, it was also important to say, we don't need the logo. You can just, on article pages, you can just say this Smashing magazine as a link. This should be enough. You don't need the logo to go back. It will be understood anyway. But this is something we did not pursue after all. And we spent a lot of time designing those buttons, those fancy, fantastic buttons. I'm really proud of that button. I spent 3 days on it. but it never made it. But we still did a couple of interesting things. And we also built a living style guide at the time, which is, I'm afraid, outdated now. But we'll talk about it later at the party. But tilting was very, very important. So basically, everything has to be 11 degrees tilted, right? And literally everything. So we developed this kind of, I would say, guide to explain what it actually means and why we actually do this. It was designed by Dan Moll, kind of explaining the angle and what we want to achieve with it with the typeface as well. And then we started doing this, just looking into how we can make it work, right? And specifically also working on animations. How can we make animations maybe play as well? And this was one of the first mock-ups that Dan came up with. And at the same time, of course, we were kind of looking and exploring different ideas and different options, specifically looking into finding that way to present a product, like the membership, in a nice, profound way, right? And it was all about finding our signature at the same time as well. And so after a couple of iterations, it took us probably 2 months or so, Una is back on stage. Excellent. We found that maybe we could do something like this, a crazy layout, which would look like this on the right side. And we had a couple of things going on there, which sometimes, some of them did make it to the final design. But it was really interesting to be able to explore something totally outside of the scope of what we're used to, kind of breaking almost what we had at this point. And we would also look into the global scope, like on the big picture, and we will also look on the small picture. And we try to find that thing that would make us unique. And so, as a result, we ended up creating something that looks like this with all this like red scheme and things like that, right? And it was also really nice because we could have these panels, which are now obviously advertising. It's not a secret, but it's nicely kind of ties in or integrates into what we have into the magazine experience. It doesn't feel foreign. It doesn't feel like it's obfuscating something. It doesn't feel like it's pushing. It's just there because it's a part of who we are, right? And so as a result, we ended up with this red thing. And of course, along the way, we had to rediscover a lot of things, mostly also related to the front-end side. I mean, we also had to think about totally rethinking, rebuilding the infrastructure that we had at the time. And I think we all tied in, when we think about responsive design, we're too tied in on media queries. Personally, I really don't like media queries. If I can avoid media queries, I will totally avoid media queries. And the reason for that is not because Flexbox can solve everything, just because we can build experiences that don't have to rely on those if-then conditionals. And I think that they're really kind of nasty for maintenance. And the reason for that is, well, we call those media queries kind of defining the scope of the breakpoints because they are breaking points. So if we look into the continuum of the experiences we're creating on the web, this is what it is. Sometimes we have ideal states. We have the one on the left, on the small screen, and large screen, and then we transition from one state to another, right? But then along the way, during the transition, we will hit those points where things are going to break. And of course, the more break points we plug in, the more media queries we break in, then the better the experience will be, but also the more time it's going to take. So if we look into the conference I attended recently, Mike was giving this amazing talk about exactly this experience, where if you put this on a scale, you will end up with situations where something just starts breaking because, you can't just make sure that your media queries cover everything. So at this point, you have this red area where text starts wrapping, for example, right? On the small screens, you might end up with a perfect experience, but in between, you will end up with some issues. So if we could avoid media queries, we would avoid media queries in the design process. So what tools did we use then? Well, probably the usual suspects, I guess, something that most of you are using anyway. We've been using Trello and Slack, and we've been using GitHub and SAS and BAM notation. Dan prefers to work from the visual mockup in the Photoshop, and then we moved very quickly into HTML, CSS. We used Preact, Gallop, and Webpack, and for testing, Browser Stack and OBS, which is just an open source tool. There are tons of them, right? So we had some problems. We had some issues with layouts, which was one of them. And this is an interesting layout, and I know that some people hate it. And then people, the reason why they hate it, because you have the picture which is totally, or the author's bio, which is totally unrelated to the article. And I think it's totally wrong and fundamentally wrong, because we are here for the community and you are part of the community. So it was really important for us to highlight people behind the scenes, because often they have like a little byline somewhere at the bottom. I think this is not good enough. We should highlight those people prominently, because they make a change. And so the layout, reflects this. And so we wanted to build this. And then it was a long journey, because Sarah was trying desperately to try to build it, and it was either this, or this, or this. But in the end, she just brought this post on Trello saying, this cannot be done. And she spoke with Leah Veru and others. It was really, really just difficult to do without all those hacky methods. And she came up with a method to make it work, after all. So here's the problem, right? So first of all, we want to have a nice structure. We want to have heading, and then the article, and then the summary as well, but in a proper logical order, right? And we don't want to create some nested divs or something just for presentational purposes. So what can we do to make this layout work? Well, we can float the section 1, the one on the right upper corner, to the right. We can float the section 2, which is the sidebar, also on the right. Then we don't float section 3 and let it wrap naturally around 1 and 2, right? And then we add our padding or margin to bring things down to section 1, to push it down. And that worked for a while until we had this wonderful idea, well, it was me actually, to float the drop cap. Because once you start floating the drop cap, it kind of ruins everything. Though it just doesn't work. So if you do that, you end up with some really, you just don't know how to float it properly. So we ended up drop cap kind of floating left and right. There is a way to make it work though, and this is how it goes. Where you say, okay, I'm going to float the section number 1, the red one on the right. I'm going to do the same with the yellow one. You don't have to float the left one. That's good. And then we're going to say, okay, we need to push that one, the blue thing, onto the top. So we're going to do it with margin bottom. Right? And then we need to push it back, because they live in the same div. We need to push the orange one down. And we kind of need to create this space between the red and the blue one, because we wanted to leave it empty. So what we're going to do there is we're going to create a pseudo element on the blue one. And we're just going to leave space to it. So we're going to define the width and the height exactly as it is, so we can so we have the same experience as when like with the orange one, right? So the height is going to be the same as the margin on the orange one. And then the only thing you have to do now is to float it to the right, and you're kind of done, right? But you can imagine it wasn't really beautiful and it introduced some problems, because what if you have overlapping? Well, then it's an accessibility issue because you can't copy-paste text. And it was kind of a problem, because if you end up with this, well, what about those links and what about those headings? And sometimes we would also have advertising that would be kind of in the beginning of the article as well. So just all kind of issues we had to solve. And we spent literally months trying to solve it until at one of the conferences, this guy said, why don't you do this? And it's just done. And I'm like, no. We spent literally 2 months trying to solve it. And then it was just about replacing padding with margin, margin with padding, and also changing the width on the heading. And in the results, we ended up with this, which is perfectly accessible and works just fine. But it doesn't matter whether you have links over here or on the right side, right? Which is really cool to have. So I'm really happy about this now. It took us a long time to build this freaking layout. Oh, I'm so happy it's done now. But then we also had some other things that we have to take care of. All right, so one of them is we have this author box in the top, right? But at the same time, when we look into it on larger screen, we kind of want to make sure that the heading appears on the top, right? Because if you look back on the larger desktop view, you have this above the auto top at the very top, box at the very top. It has to drop under the heading. So there is a simple way of doing this, of course. We can use just Flexbox, and we just use flex direction column, and then we put -1 on the heading, and we're done, right? But then we also had to do some other things. I mean, basically, this is probably something that you know anyway. But we also had to do this, where we had to keep the advertising box always docked to the right or right-aligned to this line it doesn't matter if we have 2 or 3 or 4. And this is where I think we hit these limitations with media queries. Basically, the simple way of doing this would be, OK, so I'm going to change the order property, right, with media queries. So for every single use case, can I display 2, 3, 4, 5 items? I'm going to hit the right order, so it's going to be displayed on the right. But this is so hacky, and this is not good. So as a result, in the beginning, like it was maybe 1.5 years ago, we ended up doing this, kind of creating all of those media queries to accommodate for every single use case. And we should not have to do this. And of course, the easiest way to do it now, today, would be to just use CSS grid layout for it. We just put basically that box in that grid column, and you're done, and everything else remains where it's supposed to be. Which means that basically instead of all of this, we now need to do refactoring with CSS grid layout. And in fact, the layout that we tediously created with those hacks, CSS hacks, probably can be refactored with CSS grid layout, and this is what we're kind of looking into right now. Another thing we had to take care of course, is fluid type. Again, we wanted to avoid media queries as much as we could. And one simple way of creating something that's scalable enough, and I'm not talking about font size alone or typography alone, every single component had to be flexible enough. For example, a newsletter box had to be self-contained. I didn't want to introduce any media queries to break things, to solve things, help things from breaking. And so there is a simple way of building beautiful responsive type. Just an example of this flexibility. So if you want to efficiently scale up and down, well, we know how it works. If you want to create a nice, beautiful library like this, we create a little component. That component has a font size defined in rem units, right? And then everything inside of that component is going to be defined in m units. So whenever you change the font size on the root of the component and you put it anywhere on the page, it's just going to scale up and down beautifully. That's great. And why rem and not m? Because if we have rem, we can literally move it around anywhere we like, and it's going to look the same. But if we put it in m, then it will depend on the context in which it resides. So we can do that, and that's great. And that would mean that we would probably create one media query for every single h1, h2, h3, h4 throughout different breakpoints. That's not good enough. We can create this, which is great, so it will scale up and down, but we still have to manually define this behavior. Because normally, when we look into the behavior of our components, we don't really want this. We want this. We want a very controlled growth and very controlled shrinking, right? So we have a minimum size and we have a maximum size, and we want to transition beautifully in between those stages. But the problem is, it's not like if we just increase the size with viewport units, it's not good enough either, because they always have a very strict growth, proportional growth. 1VH is always 1% of the viewport height. 1VW is 1% of the viewport width. You can't really define the growth as is, like this, for example. You can't define it unless you try to define the curve that we're kind of defining here with the font size per breakpoint and the actual viewport width. If we define it as a formula, because you could. And if you do this, and you freak out now, and please do so, it's great. And if you do so, you just need to solve a couple of things, and you need to kind of try to find what would be the perfect approximation for that curve, right? Imagine you going to designers asking for that curve. They will like that, I'm sure about that, right? But if you try to interpolate, this is what you end up doing. So you have the slope, you have the current viewport. We know this. How many of you like math? And who doesn't like to raise hands? OK, just a few people. So we just need to define this thing. And then we need to define the slope, the m. And y is basically is going to be our final font size. And x is our viewport width, right? And the only thing we need to define is the y-intercept. Now, to be honest, this is going to be a bit more complicated. And I'm not joking, by the way. But you could make it work even with CSS today. So this is what you end up doing first, right? So you have your fluid typography, and you have your rem units, obviously. And then, of course, we'll be using calc and viewport width unit. We just need to calculate the slope for each of those paragraph headings and so on and so forth, and the y-intercept. And probably it's easier if we just define it in pixels first and then translate into rem units, right? And again, it's not just about the font size. You can apply it anywhere. It could be a nav, it could be a button, it could be a lightbox. But it helps us totally avoid media queries altogether, which is freaking amazing. So as a result, you end up trying to interpolate to this formula by breaking it down into more kind of smaller steps and trying to calculate those the y. And yes, it's a SAS mixin. And yes, you still end up with lots of media queries. But what you can end up doing as a result, after long testing, is to do something much simpler, which looks like this. So you could say, I want to define my minimum, and I want to define my maximum, and then I want to interpolate between them. So what you end up doing is you set the minimum font size, which is 16 pixels here. Let's say you want to grow from 16 to 24, or the viewport range between 400 to 800 pixels, right? So you set minimum font size is 16 pixels. My maximum, the area over which I'm growing, is 24 minus 16, which makes 8, right? And then you have 100 VW minus 400 pixels, which is the minimum screen size, which is the area over which you're growing. And then you just define it by the entire range between maximum screen size and minimum screen size. And you're done. No media queries required. No excitement. Excellent, right? And so the only thing you need to do is you need to choose the minimum and the maximum, and you need to choose the area over which you're growing. Now, it doesn't have to be between 400 and 800. You can just start from 0 to 2,000, and then all you go, and you're basically done without media queries altogether, which is really, really cool. And just in case you're wondering, calc, well, we know who doesn't support calc. It's not a new story. And we know how to deal with it. We're just serving it pixels, right? And you can totally go ahead and update and apply to any kind of context, like, for example, the line height, right? The line height, I don't want to go ahead and define a breakpoint and media queries for every single change. I just want it to be done once. So the way we do it is, well, you have the minimum and you have a maximum, and you want to transition beautifully between these states. So how would you make it work? Well, you define a minimum, you define a maximum, you know how it sounds, it's exactly the same formula, so you're doing exactly the same thing. Defining the minimum, defining the growth over the area which you're growing from 1.5 to 1.3 to 1.5, then you're defining here kind of like you want to grow from 21 to 35 ems, right? And then the area over which you're growing. And you defined it once, and you don't have to write the media query, but you could. And you have this beautiful change in line height in the same way. And even you can take it even further and say, let's explore something a bit different. Maybe you could build a layout once without media queries, which is still beautifully responsive, like this one, where images are being cropped and the spacing is being recalculated dynamically and automatically, and the font size is changing automatically without you having to break in to add a breakpoint. And I know it doesn't sound like reality, because in reality it's kind of a bit different. We need to be able to turn on and turn off this kind of fluid sizing. And we still can't do that, because you could say, I'm going to put font size on HTML, right? So it's going to dynamically change as you change the viewport width if you want to. And then for a given component, I'm going to define the width and the padding and so on in rem units, like the technique I displayed before. And then you can turn it off in a fixed environment, where you could say, for a fixed container, I'm going to give it a font size of 18 pixels, and then everything inside is going to grow according to that font size. So that works, and then you end up with this, which is actually what we ended up doing as well for advertising that we still have, these some parts. Right? So if you want to have some fixed area, you can still make it work in this fluid environment. And if you need to turn it on, kind of do it the other way around, you can do that too, when you say, well, I'm going to stick to font size 100% on the HTML, and then I'm going to use for the testimonial exactly that technique with rem units. And then for the fluid environment, I'm going to define a container with calc, using that formula, and then we're going to, everything inside of that component, the subcomponents, going to be defined using em units. And you end up with this. So everything is fixed except that fluid component that you want to grow beautifully, right? And we also published an article, actually a couple of them, on smashing now as well. And this is what we also ended up using. Okay, right, just a second. So, as of now, we are running open beta. I'm really happy that we're actually almost finished at this point. There's still many things to do. One of them would be to actually clean up all the mess we created and refactor now again. We're going to move many things from Flexbox into CSS grid layout. At this point as well. And we have to look into performance issues. There are many things that we still need to do. But actually just moving, I didn't have time for this, but just moving from WordPress, which we used to use for a while, for 11 years, to something that doesn't have a database at all, with the Jamstack, was an incredible experience for us. And the results we received were just nothing short of breathtaking. And it's not because we hate WordPress or so. Hey, WordPress has served a really good role for a long time, but just the results, the performance results we can get from Jamstack are just incredible. You can catch me later, and I will maybe share a bit more with you at this point. And still a couple of things to do, and mostly, of course, migration issues. And it also means that once we have this new thing, new look, it has to be applied everywhere. So this is going to be quite a journey. Redesigning the newsletter and everything, every single thing to make it work. Now what I want to leave you with is with this feeling that I have all the time when it comes to front end. And when we were building, I was always so frustrated because I feel like you can never just get things done properly. So I know I'm running out of time, but I just want to show it, because I think it really nicely illustrates the world we're living in today. At least this is my world that I've been living in for the last 2 years. Can we turn on the audio, please? Wait. Can we turn on the audio, please? Please. No? Oh. Oh, okay. Stupid me. Because I thought it's HDMI, so it should be okay. All right. So let's see. Pretend it never happened. So sad. So this in mind. Thank you so much for your attention. If you have any questions, I'm here.